Yamuna Tira Manasati Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jai Mahatma Sabridha Rajka Dastakara Smavati Adi Saraswati Swami Bhagavad Jai Nanda Gori Vaishnava Jai Navata Haridas Bhavati Jai Names of the whole Sri Krishna Sri Radha Krishna Gopala Sam Kanda Radha Vrindavan Dham ki jai, Navadvip Dham ki jai, Ganga Mai ki jai, Jamuna Mai ki jai, Guru Dwarka Dham ki jai, Swami Bhaktivinoda ki jai. All glories to that. All glories to that. Thank you very much. Jaya Radha Madhava Punya Bihari Jaya Radha.
Hare Krishna, Prabhuji. Done with pranam.
Hare Krishna, Prabhu.
Get started shortly. So I believe we discussed only one verse last time. That was verse number 40, right?
Yes, Prabhu, I think so, yes.
Okay, so we'll begin from verse 41. We only have 3 more verses left, so we should be able to, I'm hoping we'll be able to complete this today. That will conclude the 3rd chapter. So what we can do, yeah. So Ekadasi is tomorrow, right? So
Yeah.
Apara Ekadasi, breaking fast on Dwadasi, which is Sunday, between 5:12 a.m. and 10:29 a.m.
Prabhuji, this breaking fast means that we can take grains between that time. If some is like I do fast through having quinoa or something.
Yes.
So I can take grains at that time on Dwadashi.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
That's correct. Yeah. Okay. So I'm just sending a quick message and we'll get started. Okay, so we'll get started with verse number 41. We are in the concluding portion of chapter 3, Karma Yoga, Action in Krishna Consciousness. And Krishna, having explained the importance of Karma Yoga, introduced the concept of Yajna in this chapter. And towards the end, Arjuna is asking the questions about why is it that one is forced or impelled to act in sinful activities against one's will, as if one is overpowered by a strong force, though they know that they're not supposed to do something, they still do it. So in response, Krishna explains that it is lust only which causes one to act against one's will, right? And then this lust has conquered or captured some strategic positions within the body, right? So we talked about what those positions are, right? So beginning with the senses, the mind, and intelligence, are all the sitting places of this lust. And the thing with lust is that it is never satisfied as long as one continues to cater to those lusty inclinations. So your lust means the lust of the senses, right? The five senses, they are attracted to different sense objects. Actually 10 senses, right? And if you add mind, there is 11th sense, right? And then you have the intelligence which sits on top of it. So all this, the entire the group, Indriya Granthi, right? The arrangement of all senses, they're all victims of lust. So one has to conquer it. It is because of this lust that one's real knowledge is covered, and the living entity is bewildered. Okay, so that's where we concluded the class. We'll continue with verse 41. Tasmatvam indriyani ado niyama bharatarishava papamanam prajahihinam jnana vijnana nasanam. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Translation. Therefore, O Arjuna, best of the Bharatas, in the very beginning, curb this great symbol of sin or lust by regulating the senses, and slay this destroyer of knowledge and self-realization. So in the previous verse, Krishna mentions that since the lust has occupied some strategic positions within the body, and it covers knowledge, right? It is destroying knowledge. Because what is knowledge? Knowledge means, we learn from our past experiences, we learn from our past instructions, and all that resides in the memory or the mind. And then we use that to discriminate in present situations or in situations in future that we might come across. So that discriminating ability of the intelligence is very important. So knowledge, jnana vijnana, see, both is referred to. Jnana means theoretical knowledge, right? And then vijnana means application, right? So jnana vijnana, both is described over here. So the vijnana, the application of realized knowledge, when to apply, right? There is a function of intelligence which discriminates knowledge. So first of all, one needs to have the theoretical knowledge. Both is there. It's not that one who has practical knowledge does not have theoretical knowledge. And so both theoretical and practical knowledge is there. Now, if the mind and intelligence, if both they are captured by lust, then the knowledge is destroyed, right? One cannot apply knowledge. And without application of spiritual knowledge, there's no question of self-realization. So that's why Srila Prabhupada is saying here, is translating as well, this lust is the destroyer of knowledge and self-realization. So the instruction for Arjuna is to conquer. How do you do it? Well, you have to regulate the senses, and that's what we are going to learn in this verse. So here Srila Prabhupada says, Tasmat, therefore, Indriyani, senses, in the beginning. Niyama means there are rules, so many rules and regulations. They are not to restrict us. The rules are meant to liberate us, right? So this niyama, or the rules, they are meant for liberating. So that's what this talks about. And then lust is also the cause of sin, and so that's why it's important that by application of knowledge, the lust is conquered. Okay, so in the purport, Srila Prabhupada mentions the Lord advised Arjuna to regulate the senses from the very beginning so that he could curb the greatest sinful enemy, lust, which destroys the urge for self-realization. And the specific knowledge of self. It's interesting and a very important point. Srila Prabhupada uses, he does not say directly, in the translation he's saying self-realization, but in the purport he's clarifying the urge for self-realization. So this urge for self-realization is atatho brahma jigyasa. So atatho brahma jigyasa, the inquiry into the truth, the inquiry into the absolute truth. Who are we? What is the purpose of life? Why are we here? What happens after we die? So these are important questions which can only be asked in the human form of life. But if the senses, mind, and intelligence, if they are conquered by the lust, what happens? One is just continuously responding to the impulses of the senses, the impulses of the mind, the impulses of the intelligence. And in this impulsive mode, one is always, pulled towards these objects of sense enjoyment. Then the urge for self-realization, which arises from the platform of spirit. But this spirit is covered by the false ego, which is further manifested as the intelligence, mind, and the senses. So that is suppressed. So that's why the lust, when it conquers senses, mind, and intelligence, what happens is the senses, mind, and intelligence stop supporting the soul. And so the natural inquiry of the soul for self-realization is subdued. So instead of supporting the needs of the soul, one can use intelligence to discriminate between matter and spirit. One can use mind to understand and grasp all these spiritual concepts. So this mind and intelligence, they have a very important function or role to play to assist the soul in the self-realization. But because they are conquered by lust, they have forgotten, or they are not supporting the needs of the soul, and so the urge for self-realization is subdued. So we see in the world, most people, they are simply interested in sense enjoyment. So that is referred to as, that's why they are referred to as dvipada pasuhu. They are two-legged, but they are not humans. They are two-legged animals, because the animals, they are constantly responding to the impulses and the instincts. You cannot expect them to do any better. So it's very important to conquer this lust. So jnana refers to knowledge of self distinguished from non-self. So non-self refers to the body. The real self is the Atma. Sometimes the Atma word is used also to refer to the mind or the body, but in this context and its true form, when you say Atma, again, it's referring to the spirit soul. So that is a self. The non-self refers to the body. So jnana actually does not mean the knowledge of matter. It's not, you go to Google, you find all this huge repository of knowledge. We live in the information age. The ability to distinguish between different variety of matter is not knowledge. Just like if you go to, I don't know, Best Buy or any electronic shop or Costco, and then you have this huge flat screen TVs. And I've given this example probably many times, but there's so many different varieties of it, right? What they have 4K definition, or I don't know, maybe they have 8K now, and then they have, I guess nowadays it's only LED that they use, but then I think earlier you heard LCD versus LED, and the pixel resolution, the refresh rates, and the definition, and to the no eyes, they all probably look the same, right? I mean, okay, these are all flat TVs. But those who have studied the matter in detail, and they can make the distinction, and they can say, oh, this TV is better than the other TV. This is higher resolution, Now they have curved screen now, like as if you can see from any corner of the room, right? So there are so many different variations. So that kind of knowledge is not referred to as jnana. Just like one is able to discriminate the subtleties of matter, that is not knowledge. Even a hawk can do it. The hog is interested in eating stool. It's very an unclean creature, and it finds pleasures in things which no other creature would consume, right? And the hog might be expert in discriminating. The wet stool is better than the dry stool. Srila Prabhupada used to quote this many times. It's an extreme example. And then it can it can differentiate between the two and perceives this is a better enjoyment than the other end, and the wet stool is better than the dry stool, but it's stool. So one might be very learned from a material perspective and is able to discriminate, differentiate, and study and analyze different variety in matter, but that's not knowledge. Here, knowledge means distinction of the self. Knowledge of self as distinguished from the non-self is clearly specified. So that is real knowledge. Sometimes in Indic languages, as I was telling this example, like Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, he said that if needed, and I'll come again just to write a spiritual dictionary. So actually, all these words, they have spiritual meanings, and we have hijacked it. At multiple levels, we have hijacked it, right? Like in the West, when they use guru or pandit or yoga, they have a completely, there's a horrible understanding of all these words. Yoga, the understanding of yoga that they have is completely disconnected from the spiritual underpinnings, and they know that, and they think this is progress, right? He says, yoga was shackled by the religions and the spirituality, and we liberated yoga, and now see, yoga is democratized, and it's not connected with the spiritual underpinnings, and that is considered as a progress. Pandit, they use, in it's all these debates that they go on, and somebody is expert on certain topic, they call them on a TV interview, and the debate goes on, right? And then it's, it could be completely mundane topic, but just because somebody is expert in talking about the topic, is referred to as a pandit. Maybe that's one understanding of Pandit, but the Chanakya Pandit, who is himself a Pandit, right? He explains who is a Pandit. Matravat paradaresu paradravyesu lostravat atmavat sarvabhutesu yah pasyati sa pandita. One who looks upon all women as one's mother. One who considers wealth of others as a lump of sand, and one who treats others as one would like himself to be treated, that person is a pandit. It does not depend on one's expertise on theoretical or knowledge or ability to debate, right? So all these words, they are disconnected. So like when we see, like in vernacular languages, we say, okay, you study Vigyan, like if you Hindi medium, Gujarati medium, Marathi medium, whatever, right? So when they go and study all these subjects, he says, oh, what subject you have this grade, right? They would say we have Vigyan. So Vigyan, they are referring to science, right? Science means they learn the theory, they learn the practical application of it, right? So Vigyan. So now that is a completely hijacked meaning, right? Here Vigyan, here clearly says, here like Gyan and Vigyan, it does not refer to the knowledge of non-self. It refers specifically to the knowledge of self. So it's very important to understand the spiritual meanings, and otherwise in the common parlance, a lot of words, even in our Indic languages, how they are used on daily basis, they are completely disconnected from spirituality, but each word has a lot of spiritual meaning. The entire language, especially in the land of Bharatvarsha, Bharatakhanda, is meant it's just simply meant to describe and elaborate on spiritual knowledge. So in other words, knowledge that the spirit soul is not the body. That is Gyan. And Vigyan refers to specific knowledge of the spirit soul's constitutional position and his relationship to the Supreme Soul. The first thing is Sambandh, right? So Jnana, Sambandha, Videya, Prayojan. Sambandh means understand who we are, but then part of that understanding means as soon as you say who we are, then uh, we have to define our relationships and our relationships, especially with the Supreme. Because when we say if we say body, then we say my relationship with my son, my parents, my wife, my community, my caste, my nation, my race. It just goes on. Because so that's why the fundamental definition is important. But if you define self, right, if you have the understanding the self is the soul, then the relationship is in terms of the relationship of the soul with the super soul and with Bhagavan, Atma, Paramatma, Bhagavan. And once we know, okay, we have a relationship that's forgotten, now we need to re-establish it. And so that is a practical application. So Vijnana is practical application, is Abhideya, how do I realize it? What do I need to do? And that is Bhakti Yoga. The whole process of Bhakti Yoga or Sadhana Bhakti is to revive the forgotten relationship with the Supreme. So that is referred to as Vijnana. So in Srimad Bhagavatam 2.9.31, this is a particular verse. Jnanam paramaguhyam me yad vijnana samanvitam sa rahasyam tad angam cha grihana gaditam maya. The knowledge of the self and the Supreme Self is very confidential and mysterious. But such knowledge and specific realization can be understood if explained with their various aspects by the Lord himself. Of course, Krishna is the best teacher, and Arjuna is fortunate to have Krishna directly present in front of him and instructing him. And he can describe the knowledge of the self and the Supreme Self. And it is confidential and mysterious. Mysterious means it's not, it's subtle, it's refined knowledge. It's not empirical knowledge. Like the science, empirical knowledge is things that we can perceive, and science goes even beyond that. Well, you cannot trust your perceptions. So we'll have all these tools and gadgets, and which will measure. And so this is empirical knowledge. So this knowledge is not like that. You cannot confirm by empirism. It is very refined. So it's mysterious. It might appear some people, oh, this is just all hobble gobble, just make up stuff. But so it needs refined intelligence to understand this, and it's very confidential, meaning confidential in the sense that not that we are trying to restrict this. It's not like a top secret in that nature. And we're willing to share to anyone who is interested in learning. But confidential here means that it's not accessible. It's not easily accessible. So in that sense, first of all, people are not interested. And even if they are superficially sometimes interested, and or even if genuinely interested, it requires a lot of sincerity, surrender. It's not an intellectual exercise. By application of intellect, I'll try to understand it. It doesn't work like that. So in that sense, it is not easily accessible. It's accessible to those who are really qualified, who have who are sincere, who are humble, who are willing to learn, serve the devotees, and have the mercy of the devotees and of the Lord. This knowledge is automatically realized within the heart. So it's not an intellectual exercise. And so in that sense, it is confidential. It's not easily available. Bhagavad Gita gives us that general and specific knowledge of the self. Both knowledge is there. Bhagavad Gita, general and the self. General and specific knowledge of the self. So what does it mean, general and specific? So in the second chapter, we learned in general, what is soul, right? Soul is never born, never dies. And so many different characteristics were described. It cannot be destroyed by any weapon, cannot be wet by water, cannot be cut into pieces, cannot be dried by wind, so on and so forth. And then, so these are the characteristics of the general characteristic of the self, but then specific knowledge of the self in terms of its quality. So soul is also Satchitananda, in the sense that it's minute, but it is also has the quality of being eternal. It is full of knowledge, but it's all its knowledge is covered. Just like we read that verse, just like the soul is covered with different degrees of ignorance or lust, just as a mirror is covered by dust, or fire is covered by smoke, or an embryo is covered by womb. So the knowledge is covered, but by nature it is full of knowledge, and then it's full of bliss by nature, but it's temporarily the bliss is suppressed because of association with matter. So that's so there are different qualitative aspects, and also then you go into more specific details of the relationship of the soul with the supreme, and so on and so forth. So living entities are parts and parcels of the Lord, and they are meant to serve the Lord. Jiveshu Rupoi Krishnera Niktadas. So from the very beginning of life, one has to learn this consciousness, Krishna consciousness. And thereby one may become fully Krishna conscious and act accordingly. Right? So in the verse, what did Krishna say? Well, you have to, from the very beginning, Ado. I don't wait until one is old. What's the saying in English? You cannot teach new tricks to old monkeys. So if the whole life is already spent in simply enjoyment, Indriya Arama, right? Krishna earlier we see he uses the word Arama. The purpose of life is to how I can somehow make an arrangement of quickly earn enough wealth or whatever, somehow that I can leave and retire, and just in a comfortable way, Arama. So this life is not meant for Arama. So what is it meant for? Well, from the very beginning, you cannot teach old tricks to new tricks to old monkeys. So anything, even material things, just like we teach a child from his early age, any art or any sciences, they really pick up very fast, and by they will, you can see that they will become very proficient by the as they grow old and they turn into adults. Talk about music or sports or any kind of art forms. Those children who receive training from an early age, they're able to get that proficiency. The same applies for spirituality as well. When such training is provided from an early age, one learns what is lust, where does it reside, how to capture, how to regulate. Well, how do you capture? Well, by regulating the senses, and that's what it says. So the function of the senses cannot be stopped, right? We have discussed this many times. The senses are naturally attracted to sense objects. So there's no point in artificially suppressing it, but regulating means, well, one does not engage in grossly sinful activities, and then instead of being an independent enjoyer of those sense objects, we offer those sense objects to the Lord for his enjoyment, and we take the remnants as prasadam. So that is regulation. So by regulated sense enjoyment, one can curb lust. One can easily conquer. One can develop a higher taste. And then even when one engages, in apparent contact of senses with sense object, the mentality is not that of enjoyment. One develops the consciousness that one is simply honoring the remnants. So the senses are not disturbed. The senses are subdued, just like venomous snake is subdued by the snake charmer. Right. So also another example is, even if the venom is taken out of the fangs of the snake, then it's harmless. So similarly, the senses can, when they are regulated in the service of the Lord, and they are not our enemies. So mind is also one of the senses, the most important of all senses. It sits on top of all the 10 senses. It's the king of all senses. And so mind can be one's best friend, or could be one's worst enemy. So you have to regulate the mind as well. So lust is only perverted reflection of love of God, which is natural for every living entities. In this world, everything is perverted. So it's a perverted reflection. The material world is a reflection of the spiritual world, but it is a perverted reflection. That means the nature The original pure nature is it's corrupted. So what is love in the spiritual world? Love means desire to satisfy, love is basically to satisfy Krishna's senses, that is love. And to satisfy our senses, that is lust. That's a simple definition of love and versus lust. So, but if one is educated in Krishna consciousness from the very beginning, the natural love for God cannot deteriorate into lust. When love of God deteriorates into lust, it is very difficult to return to the normal condition. Nonetheless, Krishna consciousness is so powerful that even a late beginner can become a lover of God by following the regulative principles of devotional service. So it's not so hopeless situation here. Prabhupada is giving us some hope. Even if we have taken this journey at a later phase of our life, it is still possible to achieve perfection. Many examples we read earlier in other purports. Khatmanga Maharaj, he was a Manava, but he is so powerful. He used to support and fight for, to protect the demigods. And then the demigods were very pleased and they offered him blessing, saying, hey, you can ask for any kind of opulence. As demigods, we can easily provide you. We are pleased with your service. So Khatmanga Maharaj, obviously, again, was of a mature age. I don't know, not necessarily very old man, but definitely of mature, advanced age, adulthood. And so he asked, well, before, I asked for my benediction. You tell me how much life I have left. It's a very important question. You don't have a long life. What's one going to do with all the opulences? So then God said that you only have one muhurta left. One muhurta is about 48 minutes. And he says, well, I'll just simply remember the Lord. So he knew the purpose of the life and how to achieve that perfection. And then he did not waste time to ask any other benediction. He simply remembered the Lord, and then he went back to Godhead and achieved perfection. So many examples, of individuals who have achieved perfection in a later stage of life. So from any stage of life, or from the time that one has understood the urgency, one can begin regulating the senses in Krishna consciousness or devotional service of the Lord. And the lust can be transformed again into love of Godhead, which is the highest perfection stage of human life. So that is verse number 41. I'll take a pause to see if anyone has any questions before we move on. Okay, moving on. Verse number 42. Indriyani parani ahur indriyebhya param manah mansastu para buddhir yo buddhe paratastu saha. Translation: the working senses are superior to dull matter. Mind is higher than the senses, and intelligence is still higher than the mind. And the soul is even higher than the intelligence. So if you remember, probably you're already familiar with this, but the analogy, right, of the chariot, the horses, the reins, the chariot driver, and the passenger. So if you look at the sequence, you go moving from gross to subtle. The chariot is compared to the body, and then chariot is pulled, because chariot itself is dull, just like the body is dull, right? The body itself doesn't have any volition, but just like the chariot is pulled by the horses, which could be wild, untrained. Hopefully they are trained, otherwise very difficult to control them. Similarly, this body is impelled by these senses, and the senses are wild and it's difficult to control, especially if the driver or the intelligence is not sharp. Then one can easily go astray. That's why the horses also have to be trained from their childhood. And those are nice horses, well trained. But if you get wild horses, it will still be trained, but it will take some time. So that's why the horses are superior to the chariot, because they the chariot does not have any life. Similarly, the body in itself does not have much volition. It's just dull matter. Now the senses, they animate that body. And just like the horses are controlled by the reins, similarly, the senses are controlled by the mind. And so in that sense, the controller is superior than the controlled. So the instrument. And so the mind is superior than the senses. Now these reins, they are on the other end of the reins is a driver who is holding it. And the driver is compared to the intelligence, which controls the mind. And in that sense, the intelligence is superior than the mind, just like the driver is superior to the reins, which are controlled by the driver. And well, who is the ultimate superior? Well, the passenger tells the driver. The Sarathi is simply the executor of the orders that one receives from the passenger. Just like similarly, if you ride a cab, well, you hail a Uber, and then you have to punch in instructions where you want to go, and then even after getting on the ride, you tell the driver, well, you drive slow, you're driving too fast. Can you turn the AC, um, you know, on, or keep your music down, things like that, right? So the driver takes instructions from the passengers. So Krishna has become the chariot driver of Arjuna. And he's taking instructions from the Arjuna. In the beginning of the first chapter, we heard Arjuna asking Krishna, hey, take the chariot in the middle of the two armies. I want to see who have assembled here to fight. So the passenger is superior to the driver, right? And so the soul is even higher than the intelligence. It's just the hierarchy is described over here in the purport. Srila Prabhupada mentions that the senses the senses are the outlets for activities of lust. When lust has conquered the senses, they drive the senses to according to their own whims. And so lust is reserved within the body, but it is vented out through our actions, and actions means through our senses. Therefore, the senses are superior to the body as a whole. These outlets are not in use when there is a superior consciousness or Krishna consciousness. So here, not in use means not in material use. When there is a higher taste, there is a level up. In Krishna consciousness, the soul makes direct connection with the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So now, see, earlier when the lust is in charge, who is the controller? The lowest person in the hierarchy is driving everyone, is controlling the entire hierarchy from bottom up. That's not a good position to be in. The senses, they are in the control of the mind, who controls the intelligence, and the soul is completely bewildered. But in the natural order, the soul, in contact with the Supreme Personality of Godhead, realizes it controls the intelligence, and the intelligence then controls the mind, and the mind then controls the senses. Then everything is perfectly situated. Just a second. Okay, so bodily action, where did we end? Krishna consciousness, in Krishna, the soul makes direct connection with the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Therefore, the hierarchy of the bodily functions, as described here, ultimately ends in the Supreme Soul. Bodily action means functions of the senses, and stopping the senses means stopping all bodily actions. But since the mind is active, then even though the body may be silent and the rest, the mind will act as it does during dreaming. So we all have this practical experience. Senses, they have their own limit in terms of they get tired, and the body needs to rest. The mind is always active. That's why we dream, and those experiences are real. When we are dreaming, we experience the pleasures, joy, and the pains as we would when the cross body is active as well. So mind it never stops. Mind is always active. That's why mind is superior, and it's difficult to control also. So Above the mind, so mind is superior than senses, and above the mind is the determination or the discrimination of the intelligence. And above intelligence is the soul proper. If therefore soul is directly engaged with the supreme, naturally all other subordinates, who are the subordinates, intelligent mind and the senses, they will be automatically engaged. In the Katha Upanishad, there is a similar passage in which it is said that the objects of sense gratification are superior to the senses, and the mind is superior to the sense objects. So here it's a statement which might not be obvious. How do you understand this? Objects of sense gratification are superior to the senses, and the mind is superior to the sense objects. So how do we understand that? Anyone wants to make a guess? In the hierarchy, what did we say? Well, the body is the lowest, right? Senses are superior to the body. So in that sense, somebody can argue, well, the sense objects are consumed by the senses, and so the sense objects should be lower than the senses. But here it says the sense objects are superior. Objects of sense gratification are superior to the senses. So the explanation is that here, what is sense object, right? Does anyone recall what is a sense object? You can give me an example to explain. Anyone wants to try? What is a sense object?
So for the tongue, the object could be a food. Taste, the object could be food.
So first of all, what is a sense? What is the sense we are talking about?
The sense of taste.
So the tongue, right? So
Yeah.
the sense organ is the tongue. And what is the sense object?
Food.
What is it?
Food, Prabhuji, food, like what we eat.
Yes. Then if you want to generalize it, right, what is the essence of the food? The essence of the food is taste. So taste is the sense object for the sense organ of tongue. For nose, for the sense, nose can be considered as a sense, right? Nose is a sense, and the sense object would be the smell, right? So similarly, for the skin, sense organ of skin, the sense object would be touch, right? For the sense organ of eyes, the sense object would be the form or the fire. So these are the different, yeah, it's a form, rupa. These are different sense objects. So now what it's saying is that, you know what, the taste is superior to the tongue, the smell is superior to the nose, the form is superior to the eyes. That's what it's saying. And the touch is superior to the skin. So how is that? So in the Srimad Bhagavatam, when the 24 elements and the creation, how they are created, it's described, and the sequence in which they are created. The creation always happens from subtle to gross, right? And does it make sense? I think probably we discussed this many times, but just like if you want to build a product, first of all, the idea comes within one's mind, and then somebody might sketch it, right? So we do wireframes. You need, in a digital world, that's what they call it. Build some wireframes, and then you sketch it out, and then you might build a prototype, which is grosser than the subtler wireframes. And then after that prototype, you have an MVP, a minimal viable product. And then that becomes a full-fledged product as you add more bells and whistles. As always, the development happens from subtle to gross. And similarly, the sense objects, the taste is subtler than the sense of tongue. In that sense, it is superior. So the sense organ of tongue is modeled after taste. First is taste, and then say, okay, what instrument we need to probe taste. We need tongue, right? It's almost simultaneously created, but in sequence of order, it is first the taste that is created, and then the tongue to sense the taste. So in that sense, the taste is superior. Right?
This is similar to what we discussed last time, Prabhuji. The idea comes before the vocalized idea and then the object.
Yeah, right. So always the subtle comes before the gross. Just like you can say, yeah, you have a power outlet at home, right? And then you can collect so many different instruments or appliances or gadgets to it to source your electric power. And then the appliances might be big or small, or they come in different shapes and sizes, but they all have the same cable pin which fits exactly into it. So which was developed first? Well, the power point or the cable, the power outlet was developed first, and then everything else is modeled to fit into that. So the taste is developed first before the instrument to probe the taste. Similarly, smell is developed first before the instrument to probe it is developed. So in that sense, it is subtler, and so it is superior. It dictates the creation senses. Okay, so just it's a subtle distinction, but every sentence is important. We can skip it. Say, okay, what difference does it make? It's superior or inferior, but if you there's a reason why is it, and if you take time to study in detail, then there's a reasoning for it. So therefore, the mind is if the mind is directly engaged in the service of the Lord constantly, then there is no chances the senses will become engaged in other ways. So when you have top-down control, then things are running nicely. When the management is in charge in an organization, then things run smoothly. Whether it is for the good or the bad, like sometimes the management is corrupt and they might be exploiting the labor, but as long as they are in control, the functioning of the factory is going on fine. But when there is a revolt, the labor union revolts, they take over the charge of how things are, the daily operations. They strike, or sometimes they do damage. Then everything is topsy-turvy. Yeah. So when the soul and the intelligence and mind, they are sequentially in a hierarchical natural order, they are functioning, then everything is fine. So what is that natural functioning? Well, the soul is constantly engaged in the service of the Lord, and so the senses, there's no chance of being diverted into other proclivities. So this mental attitude has already been explained. Param drishtva nivartate. If the mind is engaged in the transcendental service of the Lord, there is no chance of it being engaged in the lower propensities. In the Katha Upanishad, the soul has been described as Mahan, the great. It is above everything else. Soul is about all, namely the sense objects, the senses, the mind, and the intelligence. And it's a completely different category. Everything else over here is in the category of matter. The soul is in the category of spirit. Therefore, directly understanding the constitutional position of the soul is the solution of the whole problem. With intelligence, one has to seek out the constitutional position of the soul and then engage the mind always in Krishna consciousness. So one has to understand who we are, what's our purpose of life, how to achieve that purpose, and then you act on it. Regulate the senses. Regulate how? Well, engaging in Krishna service. A neophyte spiritualist is generally advised to keep aloof from the objects of senses. That's one level of control. If there's physical restriction at the grossest level, control at the grossest level is separate the senses physically from the sense objects. It's a good beginning, but that itself is not a solution. When the mind is not interested and is not surcharged with desires of sense enjoyment, that is a better restraint. Otherwise, if even physical restraint might help to some extent, but if the mind is not controlled, then it will compel the senses to overpower physical restraint. Sometimes people, just like, there is addiction to digital devices, one example. Then, like there are light phones available, like dumb phones. People, it's almost like a smartphone, but you cannot install much apps or basic apps, and they try to limit the stimuli, all the super stimuli that people are attracted to. So one might be able to use it, try to physically restrain, but if the mind is surcharged, they'll say, I cannot deal with this. I need to have a real, smartphone. But 15, 20 years ago, nobody had smartphone and the world was working fine. But having used it, people think, well, you cannot live without it. So even if they try to physically restrain by not using those smartphones and switching to a dumb phone, if the mind is not controlled, they will again, switch. They will come back to the smartphone. There are many examples, right? So the control has to be at a superior level, just like in organizational theory. I was taking a leadership course, and then this professor was giving an example that when he was visiting a restaurant in New Orleans, and maybe it was hot summer, and a lot of restaurants, they have this outside service, and they have jazz and other music playing, but the power went off, and they moved to manual mode where they would open the cash register and they would give out change. And just so that it's in an electronic machine, it only opens when the transaction is ringed, and then one exchange the money and it's closed, right? So you can tally at the end of the day and make sure that the accounts are fine. There's no stealing of cash. But without electricity, you cannot do that. And so this professor noted that the management actually put a person behind the cashier to make sure that this person who is operating the cash register is not stealing any money. And it kind of struck him. He's a professor of management science, so they really observe how different companies and businesses they manage their labor. And so he noted that what's the guarantee that the person who is supervising is himself not corrupt, right? Maybe there's a collusion between the cashier and the supervisor. And so it is a very low level of management control, right? It's just like one is trying to separate senses and sense objects physically. And it's a very low level of control, and it's not a very superior advanced. Because otherwise, it's not sustainable. As you're organizing, you might need a supervisor for the supervisor and a supervisor for the supervisor of the supervisor, right? There's no end to it, right? You cannot have always people, half of your workforce watching other than who's going to watch them. So what he was saying is that the whole idea is to, where you give ownership, you empower your employees to take responsibilities, and you instill values and culture where they feel that they belong to this place and they run it as if it is their own business, and then they are morally motivated to act at a superior platform. Right? Then they don't have to put all these controls in place. So similar concept, right? So if the mind is not controlled, the mind is a supervisor of the senses, right? Then you might put physical restriction, is not going to last long. So that is at a neophyte level. That's why Prabhupada is saying at a neophyte level, okay, it's a one level of control. But if as we advance, just like the organization matures from a neophyte level to a superior level of culture where the employees are empowered and they own things and they feel they belong to this place, then this lower level of control is not required. Similarly, when one advances beyond the neophyte stage, how does it? Well, by strengthening the mind, by the use of intelligence, by application of the philosophy. So when intelligence engages one's mind in Krishna consciousness, by complete surrender, just like one imbibes and inculcates the values of the company, Then one does not need cameras watching you all the time, right? So similarly, when one imbibes and surrenders to the mission or the goal of life, which is service of Krishna, then by that superior engagement, one automatically the mind becomes stronger. And even though senses are very strong, like the serpents, they will be no more effective when the fangs of these serpents are broken. So we talked about an example earlier in a slightly different context, but I think it was the same context. The senses, when the poison is removed or the fangs are broken, either way, it's harmless. There's not any harm. So then senses becomes do not do any harm to the individuals. But even though soul is master of the intelligence in the mind, the sense and the senses also, still, unless the soul is strengthened by the association of Krishna and Krishna consciousness, there is every chance of falling down due to the agitated mind. The soul is minute, and as long as the soul takes association of spiritual engagement, the strength is maintained and reinforced. Otherwise, it will be overpowered because mind is stubborn. The example that is given is that of iron. Iron by nature is cold. But when you put that iron into fire, it becomes red hot iron, right? That's what you call red hot. It starts glowing. It's very hot, and one can mold it. That's what the blacksmith do, right? Once they heat the iron rod, then they would use hammer and other tools to shape it, bend it, and it's moldable and it regains its fiery nature. But as soon as you take it out of fire, soon it will get cold, right? It will start. First of all, the oranges reddish color of that red hot iron will start going dark, turn black. It might still be hot for some time, and then after that, even the heat goes away. Similarly, the spirit soul, if you compare it to a spiritual spark, like a spark of fire that is emanating from a bonfire, which is a larger fire that's happening, just like a Holi. During Holi, we have this, we invoke the bonfire and then we go around and circumambulate it. And at the time you notice all these sparks, they come out. So when the sparks are part of the fire, they have that fiery nature. But as soon as the spark goes off the bonfire up in the air and falls on the ground, for a second you will see that it still has that fiery nature. It's trying to survive, but then soon the effect of matter, the sand in which it has fallen down, which is not of fiery nature, it overpowers the fiery nature of the spark, and the spark dies off. Similarly, the soul, when it is deprived of association of the devotees of the Lord and the service to the Supreme Lord, then it is overcome by matter, beginning with mind, which is the subtlest of all matter, or one of the subtlest forms of matter, and very stubborn in nature. And the purpose of the life is lost, and there's every chance of falling down. So that's the warning here Srila Prabhupada gives as he concludes the purport for verse number 42. I'll take a pause for any questions that anyone might have.
Prabhuji, when we discussed like how the sense objects are superior to the senses, the following statement said, and mind is superior to the sense objects. How do we explain that?
This is first, is this or previous verse?
42. You see, in this one only, Prabhuji. It says in the Katha Upanishad, there's a similar passage in which it is said that if therefore the mind, that the objects of sense gratification are superior to the senses and mind is superior to the sense objects.
How is that? Okay. So if you go back to the chart which I had created earlier, let me see. I posted over here, right? Let me share that screen.
Can I say something about that?
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, I was reading another book that was also by Sri Prabhupada, and then there he mentioned that how gradually basically any soul will transfer, or atma will transfer to the different level. So there and the example was that how the meaning of soul in three way. So the person who refers the soul as a body, he's basically just focusing on the sense gratification activities only, nothing else. So there he is we can say that the same example that your mind is only focused on your sense fulfillment. The second level of any person would be beyond the sense. Basically you are not focusing on, you're focusing on sense enjoyment, but you are still uh, thinking with your mind, or maybe your mind is active, and that would be the level two, that you are maybe thinking to level up yourself and go towards uh, your existence, that why I'm here, what I'm what is the purpose, but still you are not doing anything. And there would be a third level where you call the same soul as a atma, where you are focusing on the spirituality. You are aware that fulfilling my sense is not basic. This is just for this birth only, but I'm just helping my body, but I'm not helping my mind. Or and above that I'm not doing anything. Above my mind, that would be something like a spiritual concept, where I want to connect to the main soul, that is Paramatma. So when we go up to that levels, our definitions, or our thinking will change. And I believe in this also. I'm just trying to correlate that. Does it make sense?
I think what you're trying to say is the Atma has different definitions. Is it what you're trying to say? Like, could be referred to the mind, could refer to the soul.
Yeah. So body, then mind, and then third one would be the Atma, because Atma itself, you're talking about a part of Paramatma, and then you want to again go back and into the Paramatma again, so that you will do all the activities to go back to that level, and that would be spiritual level.
Yeah, the way I interpret this is, I think generally when we try to read something, you can first start with the direct meaning in the context, and then if that doesn't make a sense, then one can go to secondary meanings, right? So you're right in the sense that mind could refer, or when you say atma could refer to the soul, the mind, or the body. And then how do we, maybe in this case it's not referring to the mind, but it's referring to the atma. That's one way of looking at it. But if we, before we interpret in that fashion, let's try to see if the direct meaning of mind here makes sense. And so the direct meaning of mind, again, if we take the literal meaning, which is a repository of different ideas, right? How is that mind is superior to sense objects? So the way I would look at it is that if you, I wanted to show the chart, but in the WhatsApp, it does not retain the image, it seems. I know I posted on the group, but I'm not able to share it right now. But anyway, I'll explain it. So if you remember, mind is creation in the mode of goodness. If you remember that, intelligence is a creation in the mode of passion, and then contaminated consciousness is in the creation of ignorance. Do you recall that?
Yes, so actually we just pasted the chart in the chat.
So you have that. That's good. Let me see. So chat, loading image. Thank you, bro, for sharing. So let me pull this here. Is it large enough?
Yes, Prabhuji.
Let me click here. So here is here saying, I don't know if you can read my handwriting, probably not so good, but here the pradhan is where all the modes are in balance. When the imbalance is created in pradhan under the effect of kala or time, then the false ego interacts right? With that imbalance, that means goodness is prominent, and when the false ego interacts with goodness, the mind is created, mana. In the imbalance, when that happens, when the passion might become prominent, and when the false ego interacts with passion, intelligence is created, and when ignorance interacts with false ego, contaminated consciousness or chitta is created, right? So in the mind, you see, the mind is a repository of ideas, right? You agree with me? Mind is a repository of ideas. And what is smell? Smell is an idea. Taste is an idea. Form is an idea. Touch is an idea. Sound is an idea. Gandha, rasa, rupa, sparsa, sabda. So these ideas, they are generated from the mind. Similarly, senses we already know, right? So senses, now the 5 knowledge acquiring senses and 5 working senses, they all are further expansions of intelligence. In the mode, so because senses are active, they are in the mode of passion. And the contaminated consciousness actually expands into the gross elements: earth, water, fire, air, and ether. You see? Now, what did we learn? We learned that, well, the sense objects are superior to the knowledge acquiring senses, right? Gandh is the cause of nose. It is from the rasa or taste that the tongue develops. From the form, the eyes develop, right? Because the organ develops so that it probes, so that there is a correlation over here. This gandha corresponds to nose, and it corresponds to earth. You see, there is a horizontal connection here also. Rasa corresponds to the tongue. Here it corresponds to water. Right. So this is clear. Now your question is, how is that you understand that mind is superior? It's superior because, see, mind is subtler. Mind is the cause of these sense objects. You see in the order of hierarchy.
Yes, Prabhuji.
Yeah. So because it is subtler, then the mind is actually the cause, and so it is superior. Mind is a repository of the 5 elemental ideas, but then even more ideas are there, all within the mind. So that's why in this, let me download this. I might need it. I hope it downloaded somewhere. Anyways, okay. So hopefully that answers the question.
Yes,
Any
sir.
other questions? Does that make sense? Maulik?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean.
Yeah. I mean, he generally, what do I say? Like, yeah, as I was saying, like, you can, there's multiple ways you can interpret it, and what you say, is, you're trying to explain is also, I can relate to the thought process that you're going to. But as they say, Occam's razor, in the simplest explanation is generally the correct one or the best one, right? Have you heard of Occam's razor? Occam's, I forgot to spell. Occam's razor. The uses in application of science. It's not from Shastras, but it makes logical sense. This is a complex definition, but there is a simple definition. Occam's razor. Let's see. Many scientists have adopted, reinvented as in identity of, I don't know. There's a here. Oh, yeah, law of parsimony, a problem-solving principle. Let's see what it says. This might have a definition. Yeah. Among competing hypotheses, the one with the fewest assumption should be selected. That's one. There are multiple interpretations. Or another way to interpret the simplest explanation is preferable to more complex one. You see. So that's the principle that they use in comparing different hypotheses also. But so, same thing. I mean, it's not. Maybe there is a principle in hermeneutics or mimamsa of how you understand knowledge. That is also a science, science of interpretation. It's called hermeneutics in English or Latin terms, and we call it mimamsa. And there are scriptures which are written, like how do you, when you read a scripture, how you should interpret it. And there are rules that you have to follow. And I don't know, I have not studied Mimamsas, I'm not an expert in it, but there might be something similar. Maybe there is not, but which might say that you take, well, Prabhupada says that you have to take the direct meaning, and then you, which leads to the simplest explanation, because once we go into interpretation, there are so many ways one can interpret, and there is interpretation that what is the interpretation? They say, yeah, Kurukshetra, is like our body, and then the Kauravas are our enemy, and the enemies are the lust, anger, greed, and so it is all that can also be the interpretation. And so there are people who interpret Mahabharata and Gita in a very metaphorical way. Well, these are not real things, but the real personalities, but they represent things, and then we have to conquer that. And so that's, but we take the direct explanation of the meaning. Any other questions before we conclude? Let's try to finish the last verse. I think we should be able to do that. Okay, verse number 43. Evam buddhe param buddhva samstabhyatmanam atmana jahi satrum mahabaho kamarupam durasadam. Thus, knowing oneself to be transcendental to material senses, mind, and intelligence. Oh, mighty armed Arjuna, one should steady the mind by deliberate spiritual intelligence, and thus by spiritual strength conquer this insatiable enemy known as lust. So in the series of conversation, to answer Arjuna's question, when Krishna says that, well, one is impelled to act sinfully because one is conquered by lust. Now, then he explains that the lust desire resides, lust has conquered important strategic positions within the body, the mind, intelligence, the senses. And then he says, he explains the hierarchy, which one is higher, which one is superior, so that we can understand how they are interacting with each other. There's a top-down control and there's a bottom-up control also. The spiritual controls comes from top down, but if it does not exist, then the bottom up control starts manifesting, and that's not desirable. It covers knowledge, destroys self-realization. So, having explained the structure of the organization within the body, and then how the enemy attacks and how it functions, and ultimately Krishna is giving hope. Well, soul is superior. And so knowing that, oneself, that is the soul, is actually transcendental and superior to the different variety of senses and mind and intelligence, one should try to conquer. And how one should conquer? Well, he first gives the example of regulated enjoyment, right? One has to regulate the senses. And then here is saying one should apply, one should steady their mind with deliberate spiritual intelligence. So, like if you look at the Sanskrit, samstabhyam, stabhya, it conveys the idea of something that is steady. Here, Atma is referring to the mind. See here, you see, yeah, here's a great example, right? So, buddhi is literally intelligence, but now he's saying here, see, atmana and atmanam, same word. In one case, it's mind, and another is intelligence. We'll have atmanam and atmana. By intelligence, you control the other mind. So my atma can refer to both body, mind, and intelligence. But in this context, one has to understand. Further, you have to go back to previous verse and see, well, what is the conversation? When the previous conversation was about the mind, so now he's saying, well, how do you control mind? You control through buddhi and atmana, deliberate intelligence. Yeah, in this way one can conquer the insatiable enemy known as lust. Satrum, the enemy. Param, formidable. It's not an ordinary enemy. It could be very challenging. So in the purport, Srila Prabhupada mentions the third chapter of Bhagavad Gita is conclusively directive to Krishna consciousness. By knowing oneself as the eternal servitor of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, without considering impersonal voidness of the ultimate end. So whom do you serve? Well, absolute truth. Who is that absolute truth? It's not impersonal, as the Mayavadis or the impersonalists would say. So Srila Prabhupada is establishing it. Um, so it's not void. The ultimate reality is a person. In the material existence of life, one is certainly influenced by propensities of lust. For lust and desire for dominating the resources of material nature. We came to this mortal world to establish ourselves as a controller or the enjoyer, right? And so the dominating propensity to be the enjoyer and the exploiter is there. So desire for overlording and for sense gratification actually is our greatest enemy for the conditioned soul. So if we have to go back, we have to give up the reason or the intention by which we came over here. What was the intention we came over here is to enjoy, to be the controller. So as long as we continue to indulge in it, there's no question of going back. So you have to overcome that propensity. How? By the strength of Krishna consciousness. One can control material senses, mind, and intelligence by superior engagement in the service of the Lord. One may not give up work and prescribed duties all of a sudden. So that is not recommended. That was the whole reason why this Karma Yoga chapter on Karma Yoga was spoken. Yes. In the beginning, Krishna says that, well, even, what's the point in suppressing your nature? By your nature, you will be forced to come and act again. Then he also explains an imposter or an imitator, a superficial renunciant who has artificially given up sense of enjoyment. The mind is still, he uses the example, the mind is still meditating on sense object. Such a person is simply a pretender. So by practicing karma yoga, one can gradually cultivate knowledge and renunciation. Only when knowledge and renunciation both are simultaneously cultivated, one can finally give up material engagement. Well, how is knowledge cultivated and how is renunciation cultivated? Well, first is renunciation and then knowledge. First, when one begins, there's no renunciation. One is interested in sense enjoyment, but because of law of diminishing returns, one does not continue to get the same level of stimulation. But because one is engaged according to the nature, one is impelled and one keeps on going. And so then the detachment is cultivated. That means one is not interested in okay, you're getting something, some returns, but that's not the motivation by which one's working. Then one thinks, okay, then what do I do with it? Well, if I am not enjoying, then that inquisitiveness and inquiry comes, and it should be used for the right cause, and one is fortunate enough to because assume that one is already in the Vedic culture. If one is engaged according to the nature, is following Varnashram Dharma, so one has idea of Shastras. And this is a very high opportunity to inquire from someone who is learned in Shastras, and one knows that, okay, and by the habit of yajna is also there. Initially, they are doing yajna for karma kanda, right? Because they're part of the Vedic culture. He says, okay, you give it for sacrifice. But earlier than doing sacrifice, they're hoping that I'll get more in return, right? Janma Ishwarya, right? Shruta Shrivi, I'll let all this benediction. And again, I offer that, the whatever economic development that I do, whatever artha that I procure through dharma, I'll offer it back as a sacrifice and I'll get more artha. And the cycle continues. But when one develops a detachment, right, over a period of time, it should come naturally if one is engaged according to one's nature by law of diminishing returns. And one question, when I'm doing yajna, that means, and I'm not now so much inclined to enjoyment, I have some detachment developed, then who is the enjoyer, right? Yajna means sacrifice. So what is that sacrifice? Who is the real enjoyer? And so when that inquisitiveness should naturally come, and then one comes, okay, Krishna is the enjoyer. Ultimately, sacrifices, though I'm doing it through the agency of demigods, ultimately it's for Krishna's enjoyment. And so one comes to the platform of knowledge. Now, what is that knowledge? Well, knowledge is Krishna is the Supreme Personality of Godhead. He's the enjoyer, and I'm supposed to serve him. And then now, earlier one was doing yajna, but the consciousness was not pure. Now the consciousness is purified. The knowledge is cultivated. The mind becomes steady. Intelligence becomes steady. Then one is perfected. Then one can give up. Eventually, when one enters vanaprastha, because they have practiced their life of doing activities but not being materially motivated. So that's why here it says gradually developing Krishna consciousness. One cannot, many times, if you try to artificially do it, you cannot sustain it. Like if you have sometimes a vacation or a holiday and you have 8 hours, no other responsibilities. You just have to sit and chant or read Bhagavatam. People cannot do. Their mind is not. Sometimes people complain, well, only if I did not have a job or I had responsibilities, I would just sit all day and just chant and read. But they cannot. If they, it's not possible to be artificially act at that level. So by gradually developing Krishna consciousness, so karma yoga, that's why all this, one may not give up work and prescribed duties all of a sudden. So this, what is it? So karma yoga is Krishna consciousness. You're spending 8 hours at least a day on doing your work. Well, why not do it in a right way? Everything becomes a devotional service. There is no material life, spiritual life. We cannot function trying to make that distinction. We should holistically make everything spiritual, because everything is spiritual. This consciousness has to be right. So one can be situated in transcendental position without being influenced by material senses and the mind by steady intelligence directed towards one's pure identity. So this is how one gradually comes to that proper position. So this is the sum total of this chapter. This is the whole karma yoga. What is the sum total? Here the sum total. We often miss. There's so much in Srila Prabhupada's purport. We overlook it. What is the sum total? One may not give up suddenly. One has to perform karma yoga. Sometimes the idea is, well, if you do bhakti yoga, you already surpassed karma and jnana. So we can presume like that, but it's not going to help. We can simultaneously practice bhakti yoga. Of course, we don't have to wait until we achieve perfection to pick up bhakti yoga. But then, we cannot superficially give up karma yoga. I say, I'm already doing bhakti, so then I don't need to get involved in all this superficialities. That's not the case. That's not the sum total. That's not the sum total. One has to gradually come to the platform. In the immature stage of material existence, philosophical speculation and artificial attempts to control the senses by the so-called practice of yogic postures can never help a man towards spiritual life. So there's quite a few refutations over here. One is, the simple, superficial breathing exercise, disjointed and disconnected from the spiritual underpinnings by design, as they say. That's not going to help. Of course, we don't decry real yoga, which is connected to spirituality, where one really learns how to control the life air within the body, and that's going to help. That's actually a systematic process of controlling the mind. One can learn that if one is very difficult in this age, but if you could learn those things from a genuine teacher, which it's still connected to spirituality, so it's not superficial. But if you go to your local yoga studio here in Sakwas and Amish or wherever, Australia, you have no idea what they are doing, right? What else? Well, the immature stage of material existence. What is immature material? Well, earlier one is attracted to work for material reasons. So that is immature state of material existence. That is a karma kanda level. So this is at immature stage, karma, jnana, and dhyana, they are practiced in a polluted way. That's what Prabhupada is saying. See, there is a gradation. Material existence means you're working for maintaining your material existence. That is karma kanda. Philosophical speculation, that is jnana kanda. Simply gain knowledge and knowledge that I'm spirit and I'm Bhagwan and I'm part of Brahman, and by cultivating the knowledge, they hope that the impersonalists, they hope to get liberated. So that is cultivating knowledge, but then the knowledge is not cultivated in the right attitude. That is why it's called philosophical speculation. Speculation means it's there's imagination over there. It's not reality. And then artificial attempts. It's not real attempt. You go to yoga studio, it's an artificial attempt to control this. And they're not even attempting to control the senses. Right? They're only wanting to rather use yoga for more sense enjoyment. If I'm more healthy, I'll be better able to engage in better sense gratification. I have a better healthy body. That means I can do, do better enjoyment for a longer period of time, have better sex, right? So you have yoga for sex. There's so many books written like that. So this is immature, probably not even immature, but completely off, right? But what is the proper, when one is matured with proper understanding, one still engages in karma. It's not karma kanda anymore, it's karma yoga. It's not jnana kanda anymore, it is jnana yoga. Yoga means linking with the supreme. And then there's not artificial attempt at controlling the senses to artificial superficial yoga or dhyana. It's real dhyana yoga. So when one is properly trained in Krishna consciousness by higher intelligence, all of these are important. One continues to engage in karma jnana in a dhyana, but not in the kanda platform. It's karma yoga instead of karma kanda, jnana yoga instead of jnana kanda, and dhyana yoga. So all of that has an important relevance and position. Thus ends the Bhakti Vedanta purports to the 3rd chapter of Srimad Bhagavad Gita in the matter of karma yoga or discharge of one's prescribed duty in Krishna consciousness. Srila Prabhupada translates it clearly to avoid any confusion, because karma yoga is so widely misunderstood. So many different misunderstandings of karma yoga are prevalent. So it makes it clear. It's a discharge of one's duty. What duty? Not imagined duty. Well, I'm a butcher, and so my duty is to slaughter animals. Well, that's not, that's why he's saying one's prescribed duty. Who is prescribing the duties? Well, this Vedas. We learned this earlier in the chapter, right? Where does karma come from, right? What does the verse say? Annad bhavanti bhutani parjanyad anna sambhava yagyad bhavanti parjanyo yagya karma samudbhavam. So yagya comes from where? Prescribed duties. Karma is what prescribed duties, not an imagination. Where does prescribed duties come from? They come from Vedas. And then somebody might be doing prescribed duties and discharging those duties for sense enjoyment, right? In the immature state that we saw over here. That's why Srila Prabhupada is saying, no, that's not the purpose. That's not karma yoga. Discharge of one's not imaginary duties, prescribed duties, not for material enjoyment, in Krishna consciousness. That is the correct understanding of karma yoga. So Srila Prabhupada uses each word very specifically to make sure there is no confusion. So if we read and pay attention, we will see what the hidden message is, or the hidden message right out there. But if we have our eyes open, we can understand it very clearly. So I'll take a pause to see if anyone has any questions. Okay. No questions. I want to say something. Yeah, Prabhu. All right. Okay.
No, nothing from my side.
Okay, so we'll conclude today's class with this. We completed chapter 3. We'll continue with 4th chapter next Friday. Thank you, everybody. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.